There's a wonderful parallel between yoga and acceptance and commitment therapy. I think a kind of a certain level of acceptance and openness to experience that you have to have in yoga. Where you move in ways that, where you kind of find the edge of your ability to move in terms of strength and flexibility, not going beyond it, but just moving towards it.
You're listening to the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast, the show that blends science and heart to bring you evidence-based tips and tricks for cultivating a healthy, wealthy, and meaningful life. Now, here's your host, therapist, yogi, and fellow full life balancer, Dr. Caitlin Harkis.
Hi there. Today on Wisdom for Wellbeing, I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Kelly Wilson. Kelly Wilson is a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Mississippi. He was founding president of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science and is one of the co-founders of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Dr. Wilson has devoted himself to the development and dissemination of acceptance and commitment therapy, relational frame theory, and their underlying theory and philosophy, publishing 11 books, including Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, The Process and Practice of Mindful Change, and The Wisdom to Know the Difference, an acceptance and commitment therapy workbook for overcoming substance abuse, as well as over 100 articles and chapters on related basic and applied topics. In today's interview, Dr. Wilson will talk you through self-care. He shares about his first yoga class and really highlights the idea of how we need to go gently with ourselves, kindly with ourselves. He then links in a wonderful parallel of yoga and ACT and introduces you to the concept of first medicine. This idea that your lifestyle, the things you do matters for your health and your well-being, but frames it in terms of evolutionary science and how we evolve for a very different lifestyle, a very different context than what we're living today. And sometimes it really feels like an uphill battle to be maintaining our health and our wellness in a society where things are not always easy. So this is the first of 2 episodes with Dr. Wilson. He was so generous with his sharing that we've decided to give it to you in 2 digestible chunks. So please have a listen now. I'll touch base with you at the end of the episode, and then please stay tuned for part 2. But without further ado, here's Dr. Wilson now. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast. I am delighted to be with you here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and the space for us.
I'm very happy to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to find somebody who actually wants to have me talk about the stuff that I'm wildly interested in.
Well, myself and my listeners are incredibly keen. So I'm really keen just to maybe start off with giving a little bit of context to who you are and how you came to this place of lifestyle medicine.
Yeah, it's a kind of an odd it's an odd amble, because I'm not, I wasn't trained as a health psychologist, and wasn't trained in medicine. What I have spent a career doing is, probably the centerpiece of it would be the work I've done in the development of acceptance and commitment therapy. And, the therapy contains different elements, and you can think of it sliced in different ways, but one way to think about it is that the therapy teaches people to practice showing up and being present in their lives, to open up to things that are difficult, and to open up to things that are difficult in the service of things that matter, things that are of value to them. And I, for many years, I taught the values portion of this work, which has always been kind of the center of the work for me, in this way that sort of said, you could choose any of these values that you want to work on, that would make it worth showing up in your life, that would make it worth bearing pain in your life. And so, if it's being a parent or being a sister or a professional, and one of these kind of little domains was always self-care. And I used to have this joke I would tell at workshops, and I would say, if there's some of these domains, valued domains that you don't care about, that's fine. Like, for example, self-care. I would say, I'm with H.L. Mencken. Whenever I get the urge to strong physical exercise, I lie down until it passes. And, and the people in the, room would laugh a little bit, and I'd laugh a little bit. And I was doing this workshop, it's been a decade ago, and a little more than that. And, I had my little joke and everything. And then I was leading this values exercise. And in this exercise, I asked people to imagine the face of someone who they loved. To just picture, someone in your life who you're just crazy about, And when I lead these exercises, I always participate in them as I lead them. And so, I kind of think about, okay, who do I love, And I'm thinking of my kids and in this exercise. And then I ask people this question, like, can you think of a time when, maybe they caught you looking at them, where they could see in your eyes how much you loved them? Just kind of let it sink in a little bit. Like, did they ever, catch you looking at them like that? And then I ask people, what if you were someone who you loved that much? And then what would you offer yourself? And then my joke was suddenly not funny anymore. And I sat there. I was in the north of Sweden, in this incredible, beautiful forest, at this kind of set of cabins on the side of this lake, and it was just still, And I sat there and I wondered, when did it become okay for me to neglect me? And even more, when did it become okay for me to joke about neglecting me? Because I would never do that about someone I loved. Never. I wouldn't tolerate it. Not for 1 second would I stand for it. That's that kind of moment on the edge of that lake in Sweden. Sort of overturned me and really pushed my whole trajectory in a different direction. In the immediate consequence, I was like a super sedentary person, and I could sit like nobody's business, and and I didn't really, and I would tell you I hated exercise, but then I thought, I knew this. Other people had worried about me, and a friend of mine in Sweden had told me about this yoga center where I lived that was really, really good, and about this yoga teacher that was really, really good. He visited there, and so when I got home from that trip to Europe in 2009, I went down to that yoga center and got myself signed up for a year, and one thing led to another, you know.
That's an
Uh,
incredibly powerful journey. Like, what a turning moment.
well, it was that moment when I started to think, well, what if I cared for myself just in the same way I would care for someone I loved? And because I'm like a super science nerd, I started like reading the science of, well, how do you take care of a human being anyway? What kind of a critter are we? What do we need? You know? And
I
so it
love
started with the
that.
exercise, but then it just, you know, it took off, and it took off with the kind of passion that you would devote to, um, you know, someone you loved. You know, it, in retrospect, it's amazing to me that I couldn't see that. You know, I mean, you get in my trajectory, I'd been like training people in ACT for years and years and years, and training people to be kind and compassionate and caring. And, you know, here I was making jokes about my own neglect. I mean, it's remarkable how we can lose touch with such simple.
I imagine listeners might also connect with that experience and that journey in their own way, because when you were describing looking at someone that you love so much and how that feels, and then turning this gaze back on yourself, I was feeling a little bit confronted with that too. So I'm very interested in you sharing all of the steps that you've linked and you've connected in regards to how we do take care of ourselves in the way that we would someone we're devoted to, that we care about so deeply. Your yoga journey, though, just to contextualize it, if someone hasn't exercised and they're thinking, "Oh, yoga, you know, I've seen some pictures of that. It looks pretty wild." Would you mind just normalizing that journey
Yeah, I'd be happy
for
to.
listeners, please?
Actually, for the people who do know about yoga, they'll get a laugh out of my first yoga class. So I saw this teacher's name, so I you know, I went into the very first class that, you know, was on the schedule when I got home. And I got there a little bit early so that I could get all signed up and everything. And it was an Ashtanga yoga class, you know. And so I asked her, I said, you know, would an Ashtanga yoga class, you know, be a good place to start, you know, for this 55-year-old, you know, super sedentary guy? And you know, if listeners are familiar with yoga, they will know that Ashtanga yoga is a particularly vigorous practice that was like designed for adolescent boys, I think. And but she was so um, uh, wonderful, and she said, you know, it'll be just fine, but you should know that there's an adaptation of every one of the poses that we're going to do in there today. And so if you feel like your legs are getting tired or that something's difficult, I want you to feel free to drop into this pose. And she showed it to me. It's child's pose. And so this pose, you're kneeling and you kind of collapse with your chest down over your knees and your head to the floor in the same way that a child, you know, might come to rest. And she said, this is a modification of all the different poses that we're going to do here. So if people aren't familiar with yoga and they think of all these kind of twisty, vigorous, you know, flexible poses, let me just tell you that in that 90-minute class, I spent, you know, about 86 minutes in child's pose.
That's
um,
perfect.
but you know the thing is, it was wonderful, and you know, I didn't come back to that Ashtanga class for quite a few months, but I started going to classes that were um, gentle yoga for special needs. You know, so I mean, I was going to these restorative yoga classes and these super gentle yoga classes, and it, it you know, one of the things that I think people really should understand is that, and I think this is true of any sort of you know, taking on any kind of movement practice at all, is, you know, go gently. I mean, no one in the world ever started a movement practice and said, I wish I wouldn't have gone into that so gently. You know, people take up running, they take up yoga, and they try to like push themselves. There's no competitive yoga,
Yeah.
Even not like, it's not like how it looks on the yoga journal. It's not how it looks on the mat next to you. It's not even how you looked on the mat yesterday. It's like you today, in this body, in this moment. And you really can't go too gently. And I was fortunate to have teachers that were so, they understood where I was, and they really encouraged me to go slow, to go gently, to modify in ways that suited me. And man, I came back. It was like learning my own body. I at the time I thought it was like learning my body for the first time, but really it was relearning my body, because as a child I knew my body, but in the busyness of life I'd forgotten it. So it was a reconnection.
Interesting how you called it a movement practice, and that it was something that was practice, that it was movement, it was a way of learning your body. And I guess I wonder with that, because you actually went on to become a yoga teacher. So I wonder how that blends with the work you do with ACT as well, because I guess this is all linked together, isn't it?
Well, for me, everything connects to everything. So I wouldn't call myself a yoga teacher. I did complete a yoga teacher training, but it was really, and I had some ideas about actually teaching yoga, but I guess by the time I finished the training, I kind of thought, I spend most of my time, and certainly most of my career, both inside the university and out in the world, teaching. And yoga was like this one place where I wasn't the teacher, and it was kind of nice. So I never actually taught yoga, but there's a wonderful parallel between yoga and acceptance and commitment therapy. I think that there's a kind of a certain level of acceptance and openness to experience that you have to have in yoga, where you move in ways that, where you kind of find the edge of your ability to move in terms of strength and flexibility, not going beyond it, but just moving towards it. In fact, a really quite famous Ashtanga yoga teacher, David Swenson, who's marvelous, tells people to go 85%, he said, because that way, if you get a yoga teacher who's like a little too enthusiastic and they kind of adjust you to go a little further, you'll have that extra 15% in there still. So
it's a good strategy. I like it.
My thought when I was there is one way to think about yoga is a 360-degree mindfulness practice. And so there was that practice of being present in there. There was that practice of opening up to discomfort. And it was very clear for me right from the beginning that what that yoga practice was about love. It was about kindness. And so there was a value being served. So it wasn't discomfort for its own sake. It was a willingness to experience a certain amount of discomfort in the service of kindness.
That's a beautiful lens and a beautiful way of experiencing that sensationality, that it wasn't that you were pushing to 100% or going to a point of like physical pain. It was about experiencing your edge, getting to know your body and working in a way that was loving and kind and compassionate. And you talked about, Kelly, how when you were little, you knew your body, that this was this relearning of your body. What was it like when you were little? Because I gather that in some ways it's connecting back in with that little Kelly who you would want to love and cherish and treat well.
Isn't that something? It wasn't. It was. That was. It's interesting that you say that, because that's very much was my experience. Although I don't know, as I started it, that I planned it that way. I didn't really think about that. It was in the movement itself that, at the time, if you would have asked me, say, 2 years into that practice, I would have told you that I was learning my body for the first time. About 5 years into that movement practice, I began running, which I used to have this whole rant about how much I hated running and how I thought people who ran were like insane, and I see them on the sides of the road and they look like, like looks like some kind of torture, and everything. But about 5 years ago, I started running, and I'm a creature of extremes, I suppose. And my mother always said I ran hot and I ran cold. So anyway, I started running, and I kind of fooled around a little bit with running on roads, and I was able to run a bit and to actually run enough to feel the sort of exhilaration that a runner feels, and I remember the first time I've experienced it, it was sort of like, oh my God, I've discovered runner's high, Now I recognize that I was, that other people had discovered it first, but still, it was pretty exciting for me. I was like 60 years old, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this must be what those people were talking about, And I wondered, like, well, why was it? And I think that the reason that I was able to discover the kind of joy of running was because that 5 years of yoga had attuned me to my own body enough that when I began to run, I was very, I was strong. I'd practiced yoga, probably 6 days a week for the 5 years before that, and generally a pretty vigorous flow. And so when I started running, I already had a body that I was very in touch with, and that was fit and strong. Very quickly, I switched to trail running because the roads just seemed boring. And then I had a couple of small injuries. And of course, being a science nerd, I just started reading everything I could get my hands on about running and biomechanics and innervation and all this, I'm a nerd. I just can't help it. And
It's amazing, the science of running. I like it.
oh my goodness, you can't believe all of the interesting stuff out there. So one of the things that I came across was a guy named Lieberman, who studies barefoot running. He's at Harvard. And I discovered a host of books and scientific studies that were examining people who ran unshod. And by that, I don't mean minimalist shoes. I mean with no shoes at all. And of course, there are, hunter-gatherers still on the planet who, continue to live their whole lives without ever putting a shoe on their feet. And so I started experimenting around with that. And again, just going incredibly slow and really feeling my way along. I ran like a little kid runs. I didn't worry about pace. I didn't worry about distance. I'd run a little bit until I'd get kind of winded. Remember when you were a kid and you'd run, and your side would hurt a little bit, and and then you'd walk for a minute, and then somebody would go running by you and you'd take off again. Well, that's how I started running, and it was out in those woods, barefoot, that I remembered this whole childhood that I spent running in the forests of Western Washington. And I thought, I haven't always hated to run. You know, I learned to hate running when I went to school and they forced us to run. But when I was a kid, I mean, we took our shoes off at the end of school when summer started and put them back on, you know, when school started at the end of summer, and, you know, spent the whole summer like that. And it's the most natural thing in the world. And so I've been a barefoot trail runner, and that imagery of the child really came to me powerfully in the running. So the yoga really prepared me for the trail running, and the trail running, it was just so like, oh my God, it was like I grew up in a rural place in Western Washington where the nearest forest was pretty much just out the back door.
That's
My
incredible.
brothers and I just ran wild through the woods and, you know, rivers and hills and climbing trees. And so that's what my running practice looks like. Is it's not like, you know, there's no pace setting. There's no,
It
I don't
sounds
care.
delightful. And it also sounded to me really mindful, like taking your shoes off as an adult and getting a new handle on the sensations, the experience, going really gently and carefully. It sounds like it was this act of mindful movement, similar to what you would have been doing in your yoga practice, you know, learning the mindful movement.
I think that's right. And I don't think that I'm not sure that I would have come to it in that same way had I not had that long yoga practice that preceded it.
Yeah. And this is one, I mean, movement really is one of the components of your model of, you know, healthy living, of lifestyle medicine. Would you mind sort of sharing with us the other, you know, science and concepts that you in your self-care discovery link together?
Sure. I'd be happy. I've got a little chapter that I think I sent you before, and we just won't worry about the publisher too much, and we'll just let people have that sample chapter, and maybe if they like it, they'll go buy the book. So you can make it available to people for
That would
them.
be
And
fabulous. So listeners, head to the show notes, and that's so generous, Kelly. People are going to love reading that. It was so inspiring when I read it. So
well,
thank
it's my
you.
pleasure.
That's so generous.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about how because I started teaching about this. You know, as soon as I started to do it, and when I say it, you know, I don't just really mean go to yoga, because I wasn't just going to yoga. There was this other piece that was in there, and that was I was caring for myself. And when I started caring for myself, very quickly I started to think, well, this is nice that I'm treating my body like this, but then I started to look at like what I was eating, and you know, I was an extremely careless eater. I just ate whatever I felt like eating, as much as I felt like eating, whenever I felt like eating it. Probably because my wife is sort of a careful shopper, and you know, I inherited the right set of genetics. You know, I didn't, you know, become, you know, really, really large or anything, but you know, my eating was terrible and careless. And so, you know, the next piece that fell into place was, you know, how would you feed a human being if you know, what is a human's nutritional needs? So then, you know, I'm off reading nutrition science, which is astonishingly complex and confusing and confounded by money from food and agriculture industries that are really bent on misleading people. I think that there are some pretty simple steps that people can take. Anybody who says there's a right diet, I think, is kidding themselves. I think that the empirical evidence makes it pretty clear that some people thrive on a variety of different diets that are, you know, vegetarian or that contain meat, protein. One thing that, and so which way to go on that? I think that's a little please yourself and your own values, I would say. But one thing is for sure, and I think one of the reasons that you see a lot of times you'll see equivalence when you compare diets against one another, they don't really look that different. The outcomes will tend to look pretty good. High fat diet, low fat diet, like that. I think one of the reasons is none of these diets contain large amounts of highly processed foods.
Of
None of them. And as soon as you take highly processed foods out of a person's diet and you start eating something that looks like eat real food, not too much, lots of fruits and vegetables, I really think that you can go a huge distance in caring for yourself by restricting your eating to food.
That sounds so simple, food. Doesn't it? But yet, like, food is not something that is as easy to consume as it should be, perhaps, or we might think it is. Well, we're surrounded by.
The problem is the things that get sold as food contain all kinds of ingredients that are either not food at all. They're just, manufactured, colorants, stabilizers, humectants. You ever notice like those cookies that, you can leave them on the shelf for like 6 months and they're still soft? That's because they contain chemicals that are called humectants. And what humectants do is they have an affinity for liquid, and they pull liquid out of the atmosphere so that it keeps them moist.
I had no idea.
You're right, exactly. I just don't know that you want to eat things that are, or things that are like things like stabilizers. Well, your digestive system is kind of by definition destabilizes, like you eat something and it's a whole thing, and, you begin to destabilize it by chewing it up, and your digestive system is taking it apart, Stabilization has to do with, food preservation and things like that. So, I'm not nutty about these things, being able to preserve food is a good thing. But, the problem with these really highly processed foods is that they often contain things that aren't food and have no nutritional value, some of which have cause harm, and some of which would not be harmful in and of themselves, but they've never in our evolutionary history been available in such quantity.
Yeah.
For example, sugar, added sugars in foods, never in human history have we had access to the quantities of sugar that we have access to right now. So they contain things that in our evolutionary history were sort of rare and fine as a rare thing. And they contain very little of some of the things that were very common. So they take the fiber out, which was extremely common in all the kind of vegetable matter that we ate. They add sugar in, which was extremely uncommon.
And our bodies have not evolved at the same extent as, this easy consumption of processed food. Our environment has not, I guess, evolved in such a way that it's conducive to how we process food, for instance. Is that right? What's the evolutionary component in this?
Yeah, well, if you sort of look at it from an evolutionary perspective, like access, if you look in like at the United States, if you go from like colonial times to the current era, and the numbers will be a little wonky because it depends how you make the estimates. But I've seen estimates that suggest we ate as little as a few pounds of sugar per year in colonial times. and that the average American is exposed to something like 90 pounds of sugar a year,
Oh my
100 pounds
goodness.
of sugar a year in a diet of highly processed foods. And if you go to the store and pick something off the shelf, and look at the ingredients, like go down the cereal aisle and, pick, and not only will it won't have sugar as the first ingredient, so the one, but what it'll have is it'll have 4 or 5 different sources of sugar in it. And there's a reason. It's a bit of trickery that they're engaging in. You might wonder why they have cane sugar and sugar from fruit, and high fructose corn syrup, and 4 or 5 different kinds of sugar. Well, the way the labeling thing goes is they have to put the ingredient there's most of, it has to be the first ingredient on the label. But if they put in 5 different kinds of sugar, then each one is a sort of a smaller amount. And so it gets spread out across the label. If they had to list it as a single ingredient, there are a lot of foods out there where it would be the first ingredient.
Oh my goodness.
Nothing in our evolutionary history prepared us for that. And really, it isn't about the sugar people put in their own food. For example, when was the last time you had a cup of coffee where you put 20 spoons of sugar in a cup of coffee?
I can say
never.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, who would do that? I mean, no one. But you know who does it every single day? Starbucks. They serve millions of them every single day. There, where there's like an equivalent in some of these big kind of frappuccino kinds of things. There might be an equivalent of 20 or so teaspoons of sugar in one of those. There's sugar in the natural world, take something like apple juice. People think of that. Oh, that's a very natural food, right? Apple juice, what could be more natural? But in fact, apple juice is not at all natural. It requires considerable processing to get that juice out of the apple. And there's something really important and magical about an apple, and that is that it contains so much fiber that it protects you from the overconsumption of sugar. So, for example, and actually, when I taught this stuff to undergraduates, and I wanted to give them a dietary advice, and so this is a real actionable kind of a thing. Like, if you know you're going to go out and eat tonight, and you're going to eat unhealthy food, then eat an apple before you go. Right?
That's so simple.
Well, think about this. If you had told your mom was like making dinner or something like that, and you said, "Oh, Mom, I'm going to have an apple like right before dinner," she'd say, "No, don't eat that apple right before dinner because
you'll spoil your appetite."
You will spoil your appetite. Okay, so you can take advantage of the fact that yes, that apple actually will spoil your appetite. And so if you're going to go out and hog down on sausage pizza or something like that, if you eat an apple before you go, you'll still eat pizza, but you won't eat as much.
That's incredibly actionable. Everyone can do that, can't we? We can have a little bit of a thing, keep a store of apples on our hand.
If you're feeling guilty, like you're in the middle of this crazy pandemic and you're thinking, like, I just cannot bring myself to make anything but mac and cheese for dinner. Give the kids an apple first. Spoil their appetite, because an apple, it's a pretty healthy thing to eat. And I've asked people sometimes, like I was talking about the amount of sugar in a big frappuccino. You could get that same amount of sugar in 4 or 5 apples. But when was the last time you ate 4 or 5 apples at one time? Never. It would make you sick if you tried to eat that many apples, right? See, the fiber in there protects you from over-consuming the sugar.
I really like the idea of it being a practical thing that we've got that, like an apple, that it's wholly packaged, that it comes with the fiber, that makes it, entirely appropriate for our digestion and for, giving ourselves food that is whole, as you said, and that it's a pretty healthy snack. Why is it so hard for us to reach for the apple when the mac and cheese is sitting there? Why are we drawn to one over the other?
Well, this is kind of an evolutionary dirty trick, So for millions of years, as we evolved out on the savannah, we lived in a state, life was hard. And we lived in very often, maybe during certain seasons of the year, there was lots and lots and lots to eat. But during significant parts of the year, when we were hunter-gatherers, which is most of human history, you had to go out there and scrap. You had to go out there and hunt for food. You had to go out there and dig in the ground for food. You had to scavenge food. And it takes a lot of calories to get that food enough that, human beings lived in, on the edge of calorie debt for a good part of human history. And when calories are scarce and hard to come by, it's an evolutionary advantage for you to prefer foods that require fewer or that are high in calories. And so to have a taste buds that sort of say, fat, good, sugar, good. When you're in a world that has too few calories, that affinity for high calorie foods is your friend. The ones that didn't like high calorie foods just wandered around the savannah in crazy calorie debt. The day came when the debt was too much to pay and they died from it. Same thing with physical exercise. Evolution, because calories were scarce, evolution favored the ones that took the easy way up the hill, not the hard way up the hill. So, if there's an easier way to get the calories, evolution sort of tipped us towards that. There's a principle in the psychology of learning called the matching law, developed by a guy named Bernstein. And the matching law basically says that an animal, including a human being, will distribute their behaviors according to the density of reinforcers. So wherever the most reinforcers are, that's where you're going to begin to distribute your behavior. So it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that we'd prefer the most calorie dense foods that are the easiest to get. Now, what I just described is phoning in order for pizza delivered.
Yeah, totally.
It's high calorie. I don't even have to get out of my chair, to secure those calories. So the engineered world, and don't get me wrong, I would not go back to that world. Just 200 years ago, we buried half of our children before their 5th birthday. Half. Like global infant mortality, child mortality, just even 150 years ago was something like 43%. The most recent data that you can find, like on Our World and Data, global child mortality is about 4% right now. 4%. That's an order of magnitude in difference.
Yeah.
Maternal mortality has dropped 2 orders of magnitude in the last 200 years. So that's like from 1,000 to 100 to fewer than 10 in 10,000. That's,
yeah.
So the good old days, they weren't that good.
No.
But the modern world that has allowed us to preserve food and to stockpile food, which has many, many benefits, we have to recognize that it is a risk factor for our health, that abundance.
So the abundance, yeah, because we are trying to conserve our calories. So, the ringing up, getting the pizza kind of takes care of the pizza delivery, as well as providing us something that, is scrumptious in the sense of dense calories. Those of us who, well, I mean, all of us right now, let's face it, COVID is global. I imagine that calling and ordering a pizza is something that, a few people have been doing here and there. The other thing that's going on is social disconnect. And I know that social activity and social connection really functions into your first medicine approach. Would you mind sharing a bit about that? And maybe then we can come back to explaining some strategies to help get us through this.
Sure. If I had to um, um, make a guess at how I survived my extraordinary self-neglect, I would guess that the way that I survived is that I have been persistently embedded, for the last 35 years in a wonderful, loving community. And I've done work that is really a labor of love. I mean, I make no bones about it when I do psychotherapy, when I teach psychotherapy, that I love my clients. I love them.
Yeah.
And that work is an expression of my love. And when I teach therapists and I teach students, I love my students also. And the teaching of that work is an interaction of that love. It turns out that social connection, is as important to us as food and water. It is a good social connection will buffer almost any other risk factor that you have. There is, on the other side of that, social toxins that will put you at heightened risk for every other risk factor that is out there in the world, including things like viral immunity. There's a whole area of work that's called social genomics. And it's pretty readily understood from an evolutionary perspective. So for those millions of years of evolution, we lived in small social groups of, perhaps 50 or so. And this was a world where you knew and interacted with everyone in the world that you knew every single day of your life. Right now you have places like Stockholm. Something like 50% of households are single-person households in Stockholm.
Oh, wow.
If you look across the U.S., it's between 20 and 30%, depending on what region. I'm not sure what the numbers in Australia, but I would suspect they're similar to U.S. numbers. Never in human history have so many people lived alone. Harry Harlow, the experimental psychologist, had a saying that a lone monkey is a dead monkey. And so if people have ever taken an introduction to psychology course, they will remember an image that is in probably every intro psychology text ever written. And the pictures are of these little capuchin monkeys. And instead of being raised by their mothers, they created these little wire frames that had a feeding tube on it so that the monkey could feed on it. And some of them, the images have kind of a little stuffed mama monkey with, a feeding tube where the monkey could feed. And some just had like a sort of a wire frame one. Some of them had like this kind of stuffed monkey with like little eyes and like that. And these infant monkeys that were placed, where they had enough food and they had everything they need, but they had this kind of wireframe mommy, became incredibly neurotic. And the images are heart-wrenching. These little monkeys have these kind of repetitive rocking behaviors that they'll engage in. They'll bite on their own hands and like sort of self-injure.
All attempts to like regulate their emotional disconnect and distress.
Yes. And this is just from social isolation, just from that disconnect of that nurturance. Now, people have seen those pictures, but the pictures that they haven't seen very often, and I think these ones are really important and really interesting, is if you took those little monkeys that were raised like that end up very neurotic and they're very under-socialized, if you put them in a colony with other, a colony of monkeys that are, different ages and like that, they can detect that little monkey is impaired in that way, and they'll actually be aggressive towards it and will injure or even kill it if they have a chance. But, and this is important, they found that if they took a juvenile monkey, like another baby monkey, out of the colony and put it in there with this neurotic monkey, the little baby monkey kind of looks around, because it's a social mammal. It wants to be, with others of its own kind. And so the only other monkey in there is this kind of neurotic monkey. And so they'll go over and they'll kind of put their little hand on the other monkey, and the kind of neurotic monkey will try to push them away, will try to get away from them. But that little baby monkey, see, it doesn't know anything about hierarchy yet or anything like that. And so it'll continue to try to be next to him. It'll stand next to him and nudge up and touch him a little bit and like that. And it'll just persist. And eventually, neurotic monkeys would begin to interact with that baby monkey. And over a period of weeks, it would rehabilitate them. And pretty soon you'd see them in there interacting and playing with these juvenile monkeys. They didn't have any training in psychotherapy or anything, but they were able to rehabilitate. There's a really important lesson in those studies, and it is that we are that kind also. All the way down to the molecular level, your genetics are regulated by your social environment. Good social environments upregulate parts of your genome and downregulate other parts of your genome. Exposure to social toxins, that would include social isolation, that would include social hostility. Those things turn on genes that code for these kind of pro-inflammatory processes. So things like inflammation that you'd get from an injury, that you'd get from being poisoned, like a toxin, that you'd get from an infection, you'd get in these inflammatory responses. You can also get from hostile social interactions. So it actually changes your immune system and upregulates all this inflammation. I said that social exchange was protective for immunity. It upregulates those inflammatory processes, but it actually downregulates another part of your immune system. So you sort of have two immune systems. You could think of it this way. You have your innate immune function, and that's these kind of immune functions that don't have to be learned. So, if you get, whacked with a stick or something like that, you don't have to learn to have inflammation around the site of the injury. It will just happen automatically. From birth, you have that capacity. But there's another part of your immune system, which is your adaptive immune system. And your adaptive immune system is that part of your immune system that gets exposed to viruses and things like that. And then it learns how to build antibodies to fight those different kinds of infections off. That part of your immune system, under the threat of social hostility, is actually downregulated. Now, if you think about it, it makes sense, because when you're under attack, the threat is not that you're going to catch a cold. The threat is that you're going to get disemboweled, eaten, killed, right?
That's the evolutionary element again.
Exactly. This is why Harlow said a lone monkey is a dead monkey. If a monkey finds himself out there alone, it turns up all of this kind of fight or flight, all of those kind of stress hormones are all upregulated. Now, if it just happens momentarily, they're upregulated momentarily. Then you go back in a safe environment and they downregulate. But if you're chronically exposed to those social toxins, it will upregulate those genes that are coding for that sort of response, so that they get upregulated and will retain some of that upregulation. This produces chronic illness, that chronic upregulation. Momentary insult, a human being can take a hit. I mean, we can take a whack, a terrible meal, doesn't hurt. We can poison ourselves, and in fact, we do it frequently. I'm not recommending that, of course. Intoxication, like, you got to get that the root word in intoxication is toxic, right? So we expose ourselves to toxins, and individual exposures to toxins, including social toxins, we're pretty able to come back off of those. Chronic exposure to toxins produce a chronic illness.
That's a good way of remembering it. Chronic illness from chronic exposure to toxins, both physical and social.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, there you have it. Part 1 of such a fantastic interview with Dr. Kelly Wilson on the concept of first medicine, of lifestyle medicine. And as Kelly has so generously offered to you a wonderful chapter summarizing first medicine and evolutionary psychology in the acceptance and commitment framework, please just head to drcaitlin.com to be able to download that book chapter. Also, if you've connected with Dr. Wilson, please check out his books. If you've ever experienced any sort of anxiety or overwhelm, which I know I certainly have, his book, Things Might Go Terribly, Horribly Wrong, is a brilliant resource, as well as his book, The Wisdom to Know the Difference, which explores addiction, something that Kelly is very open and transparent about having suffered and experienced in his own lifetime. You might also like to check out his webpage, onelifellc.com. And of course, I will link to all of these references in the show notes. And then I will see you back here next week for part 2 of Dr. Wilson's wisdom. All right, bye for now.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Wisdom for Wellbeing podcast. Please visit drcaitlin.com to connect, find show notes, other episodes, and to subscribe. While you're at it, if you find value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating, or perhaps simply tell a friend about the show. Wisdom for Wellbeing is not a substitute for professional, individualized mental health treatment. If you are in crisis, please contact 000, your local emergency number if you are outside of Australia, or attend your local hospital ED.